This video begins a two-part series on jQuery and how it relates to the DOM. In this section, we will introduce jQuery. While JavaScript is a powerful language, it has many flaws. The DOM can be clunky to use. It's not well designed and organized. The same code doesn't always work the same way in every browser. For instance, it might work great in Chrome or Safari, and in Internet Explorer it will fail, and vice versa. As a result, many developers work around these problems with hacks. For instance, checking if the browser is IE, then do this. If it's Safari, do this. Or if it's Chrome, do this. This leads to a lot of extra work and hassle that doesn't really need to be done. As a result of these problems, JavaScript developers have developed libraries that expand the JavaScript language, add features, classes, and methods. To use these JavaScript libraries, all that is required is to link to the library in the script tag in your HTML document. Some of the more popular JavaScript libraries are jQuery, Prototype, MooTools, Google Closure, and there are many, many more. In this class, we are going to use jQuery. Why jQuery for this class? Well, as of today, it is the most popular JavaScript library out there, with over 50% of the JavaScript programmers using it. As a result of this, it is likely that you will encounter jQuery after this course. The jQuery JavaScript library adds many useful features to JavaScript. It contains many useful extensions to the DOM. It adds utility functions for built-in types of string, array, object, and function. It improves event-driven programming. It contains many cross-browser compatibility fixes, which means you write it once and you can use it anywhere. And as we'll see later, it makes Ajax programming a lot easier. An example of improvement and simplification is the window.onload event. We use this event since we cannot use the DOM before the page has been constructed and all of the elements have been initialized. jQuery gives us a more compatible way to do this. The DOM way of accomplishing this is to look at the window.onload event. What this says is when the window has been fully loaded and initialized, we can then execute the code. Instead of looking at the entire window to see if the window is loaded, ready, and initialized, jQuery improves this by adding a ready event that can be attached to each element. Whenever this element is initialized and ready to be used, the ready event is fired. The jQuery way to accomplish this is to simply do $function, and then we put all of our code there, which basically says when the document element has been initialized and ready to use, this function is then called. In this video and the next video, we are going to take a look at the following aspects of DOM as it relates to jQuery. The identification, which is how do I obtain a reference to the node I want. Traversal, how do I move around the DOM tree. Node manipulation, how do I get or set aspects of a DOM node. Tree manipulation, how do I change the structure of the page. In this section, we will look at the DOM and how to interact with it using jQuery. The DOM tree refers to the nesting of the elements on the page and how they form a tree-like structure. In this example here, you can see that the root node is HTML. Underneath it, you have the head and the body. Within the body is our HTML tags that we are used to. H1, paragraph, unordered list, and so on. One of the challenges in working with the DOM tree is to single out the specific elements that you want to work with. However, this is not such a difficult task now, as you have been doing exactly that with your cascading style sheets. JavaScript provides us some functions and methods to do this. We have already been using getElementById. This returns a single element on the page matching that ID. We can also get elements by tag name. For instance, we can get all of the div elements or p elements. We can also get elements by name, which is useful for returning back controls. JavaScript also provides us with Query Selector and Query Selector All, which allows us to use CSS selectors to get the elements that we want. Here is an example of getting all of the p tags on the page and styling them yellow. First of all, we will use document.querySelectorAll to get all of the p tags in the document. Then we will use a for loop to loop through each of these elements and then apply a background color of yellow. While this may work in my current browser or version of browser, it may not work in others the same way. Also, since the DOM is the main thing that we use to manipulate the HTML document or page, there are too many ways to accomplish the same thing. For instance, why do we need separate functions to get something by ID and then to get something by tag name? It would be great if we had one function that accomplished all of these things and returned back the same objects for us to work with. jQuery did exactly that. They created a function that is called a $sign that accepts in the CSS equivalent value to get a DOM element. For instance, to get the document by ID, you do $sign to call the function and £ID. To get the name of a tag or a CSS selector, you simply put in that particular text. To get an element by name, for instance a form, you do bracket name equals that form, just like you would do in CSS. This makes it a lot easier to get the elements that you want by keeping the format consistent with CSS. In working with the $sign function, take note that this object always returns back an array. So to get a single element, we need to reference the first index. To get an element by ID, we call $sign function with pound and ID. Since this is a unique object, we need to reference the first index. If we want to use a group selector, we simply add the additional query parameters to the same function. In this case, we'll get the ID along with all paragraph tags. We can also do the same thing with the context selector. In this case here, we are looking for the ID, and within the ID, we are looking for the first div, and within that div, we are getting all of the paragraph elements. And here is an example of a more complex selector. Now with the jQuery all-in-one selector, we can greatly simplify our JavaScript code. As we looked at in a previous example, to get all paragraph tags, we had to call document.querySelectorAll and then loop through that array and then do the work that we wanted to do on the elements. However, jQuery greatly simplifies this. Now we can use the $sign function with p, which returns back an array of objects. On this array of objects, we call .css, which sets the CSS properties for all of these objects. Now before moving on, it might be helpful to talk about some terminology used in jQuery. The jQuery function either refers to the $sign function or the global jQuery object. A jQuery object is the object returned by the jQuery function that often represents a group of elements. Selected elements is simply a filtered set of DOM elements that you might want to work with. As we stated before, the jQuery function always returns an array-like object. This jQuery object wraps the originally selected DOM objects and provides a container for working with them in additional ways. You can still access the actual DOM object from within the jQuery object if you need to. Here is a comparison of the jQuery object and the DOM object. The first example is false since getElementById returns a single object and the jQuery object with the $sign returns an array-like object. The second example is also false even though QuerySelectorAll returns an array of objects. This is because an array of DOM objects is not the same as a jQuery object. The remaining three examples are all true because in the jQuery object, we are directly accessing the DOM object within it. We are doing this by returning the first index within the jQuery object. You can convert any DOM object to a jQuery object by simply wrapping it in the $sign function. Once you do that, you can then use the functionality of the jQuery object. As in this example here, we are getting an element by ID through the document object. Once we have this object, we simply wrap it in the $sign function, pass it to that, and the returned object back to us is a jQuery object. You can search within any DOM object using the functions querySelectorAll and querySelector. When you do this, you are only searching within that DOM object and any child objects that might be in it. This is programmatically equivalent to a CSS selector. For instance, we have our ID, and within this ID, we want to get all paragraph tags and make them red. In this example here, we get the first UL tag. Then we search within this UL tag to get all LI tags with class special. We can do the same thing using jQuery. We can either use the $sign function and use the CSS selector code as the first argument and use the element to search in as the second arg, or we can call .find on the element to search within.